Atlas Salt continues to capture the attention of small cap investors all across the world as they keep proving why their Great Atlantic Salt Deposit and Fischell's Brook Salt Dome are truly world class. These assets are industry disruptors, and any major within the mining industry has no other choice but to take notice here. We sit down with President Roland Howe and CEO Patrick Laracy to discuss the 43101 just released for their Fischell's Brook Salt Dome and a key development that has major implications for Great Atlantic, the premier undeveloped high-grade rock salt project in all of North America. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hey, Brandon.
Hi.
Well, I appreciate your guys' times, and let's just jump right into it. We'll get to that key development for Great Atlantic shortly, but I'd like to first begin with Fischell's Brook. Roland, this 43101 suggests there's an incredible amount of salt at Fischell's Brook, an exploration target of 1.76 to 3.1 billion tons just within the lower basal unit in a constrained conservative basis. For a new investor, what are the potential uses for this salt before this dome is ultimately hollowed out and used for storage?
Well, hollowing out the dome, you do that by solution mining, and the sort of structure we have here, this salt structure is perfect for that purpose of solution mining. And that salt just comes to surface as a brine, not like a solid granular particle like we're talking about at Great Atlantic. And that brine can be recrystallized, processed. And that is just salt you typically see on a table, but also goes into chemical industries for PVC. It can go to pharmaceuticals if it's high enough grade, baking. It just has so many uses that, there are more uses for salt from brine than there really are for highway de-icing salt.
Yeah, and I think that's important for investors to know because obviously it's talked about storage, it's talked about all these different elements, but there's a lot of salt there, and it appears there's also a lot of use for that as well. Patrick, the 43101 for Atlas's Fischell Brook Dome had a 3D gravity inversion model that suggests this deposit is truly massive, with the lower unit model to extend to a depth of at least 2,400 meters. That's more than twice that of the historical Hooker number 1 hole, which ended in salt at 1,100 meters.
Yeah, well, Fischell's Brook, as you mentioned, based on the gravity modeling and historic drilling, is a very big dome. Fischell's Brook number 1 salt dome is about 500 hectares. The largest dome in the Petroleum Strategic Reserve is about 200 hectares. So we are in world-class scale, no doubt about that.
Yeah, and one thing I really want to make a mention of is that the political aspect of this and the government aspect is very, very unique in the sense that there is this major push by the U.S. government, by the Canadian government. We saw Biden being instrumental in providing $503 million loan to the Utah project. We have Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister in Canada, speaking about the importance of the Green Initiative in Canada as well. Do you think that really bodes well for Canadian properties like Fischell Brook at the potential of really getting not just the local governments on board for this, but also the federal as well?
Yeah, well, potential storage underground is a component of an energy project, right? In Western Newfoundland, we've got a very high endowment of wind energy that's never been developed. And we foresee that wind energy being used to power some industrial application. The one that is the leading candidate currently is hydrogen development. And there are several world-class companies looking at Western Newfoundland specifically for that purpose. As we know, Western Europe are reevaluating their sources of energy. And there's a delegation that has been in Canada and apparently is coming again very soon, particularly the German delegation, looking at opportunities in Canada to generate new energy sources to supply Europe. So we feel we're in a very advantageous position because we do have this potential underground storage, which we feel is going to be a necessary component of providing storage for an energy project in Western Newfoundland, and certainly most likely a hydrogen project.
Yeah, very fascinating. And I appreciate you going into detail there. A question I'm sure is on many investors' minds right now. Now that the 43-101 has been completed and released, what are the next steps for the new management team of Triple Point Resources once the spinout is complete?
So, as your listeners may be aware, our AGM is slated for August 31st. At that time, shareholders hopefully will approve the creation and spin out of Triple Point Resources. Following that shareholder approval, there's a series of legal processes that we have to go through. We're expecting September 21st to be the distribution record date. That is the date upon which you must hold Atlas shares in order to receive the SpinCo Triple Point Resource shares. So following shortly after that distribution record date, we expect to get listing on the Canadian Stock Exchange. We're in the process of making that application as we speak.
Yeah, fantastic to hear, and lots to come on that. So investors should be paying attention. Speaking about paying attention, there's a term that's been used recently, inflationary dynamics. Roland, I'd like to speak about this for a moment. This is the term Compass Minerals just used in its Q3 filings to speak about the rising costs they're facing at Godrich that are hitting their overall profits. What do they mean by this term inflationary dynamics, and what implications does this have on market share and the industry as a whole?
I think inflationary dynamics is just a broad term for what's happening globally. Inflation is rampant, and obviously, if you have some high costs, and old mines tend to have a lot of legacy costs. Mines don't get smaller; mines get bigger when you start them. So old, and many of these mines are 60 plus years old. So there's a lot of structural costs associated with supporting a mine. So obviously, inflation is going to be hitting those a little more disproportionately. A new mine is going to have a starting point, which is a smaller footprint, is going to be easier to maintain and lower costs in that regard. But certainly, the Compass statement the other day, the news release was interesting. 75% of the way through the market bid season, they're saying that actually they're seeing prices increasing by about 14% on what they've bid on so far. So obviously, they're coming at it. They've got to recoup some of those inflationary costs pressures. What they've done is basically refocused their marketing campaign and to chase margin, make sure that they've got the best margins. And in doing that, they're saying they're actually down 13% at this point in volume. Now, 75% of the way through, there's plenty of time to actually recover some of that. But it just shows that their focus, their concern is making sure that their margins are maintained. Logistically, obviously, Compass has got a certain region that they can really supply within and keep their margins high, and others probably overlap, and some of those overlaps in the past have been taken by Compass, and that's on the edge of their economic range, perhaps. So that's where they've chosen not to be so aggressive this year and maintain their volume in high margin areas.
Yeah, and I like to focus on the age of these current mines a little bit further here as well. There are about 15 operating salt mines in eastern North America. None were built within the last 20 years, and most of them have been built and been in production for many decades, and every single one of them is shaft access instead of the much cheaper and continuous ramp access contemplated for Great Atlantic. How does this all come into play when entering potential buyout talks with majors?
What we're proposing, and we're well into the feasibility study, which we expect to be available before the end of 2022. But we've talked before about salt mines; they have a long lifespan, and we've got massive deposits here. And the thing is that the last one was actually 20 years ago, and that mine replaced an older mine that ran into some problems. As mines get older, obviously the structural issues there. Like you say, they're all shafts. But some of the older mines are going to be starting to see some limits maybe to their reserves. The ability for us, because we're actually so shallow and being able to access with inclines, is that it just gives us so much flexibility in terms of operations. You've got continuous access. And I've used this analogy before. If you're in the mall, do you use the escalator, which is continuously running, or do you wait for the elevator and just go up when it's available? That's what an incline gives you. It gives you continuous haulage, continuous access, and that is a huge advantage, one that none of the other mines in this region have got.
Yeah, and hence why even just in our interviews in the past, you've always talked about the Great Atlantic having that potential of being the cheaper, lowest cost, continuous mining, salt mine in all of Eastern North America. Very, very exciting times, absolutely. But there's also talks about being able to replace things like the imports that are coming in from Chile and from Egypt. And that's the last thing I'd like to talk about is logistics, more specifically on the location of the Great Atlantic deposit on the west coast of Newfoundland. Why are you so well positioned to supply the Eastern North American market, but especially, like I just mentioned, when speaking about the imports currently coming in from Chile and Egypt?
Many of the mines are landlocked in this region, but this is one mine that will have access to a deep water port. And being able to ship large quantities of salt by water is a huge advantage economically, logistically. And that's where we see the ability to reach the East Coast cheaper. A couple of days as opposed to a couple of weeks on the water, lower fuel costs, and being able to react more quickly when there's a supply request put in. Supply chain is something that worries everybody. So, would you rather have your supplier of something as important as road salt for highway maintenance in winter? Would you rather have it a couple of days away, or you'd rather have it a couple of weeks away? And certainly that location is the thing that comes up often with Great Atlantic. It's in a fine spot. It's a great deposit. It's got great potential for access, and it's got the water there as well.
Yeah, and it's really important what you just said there too, is that some of these boats can be taking 10, 12 days plus to get across that ocean, whereas for yourselves to reach a lot of these different destinations in Eastern North America, it could be 2 days or 3 days, and with smaller vessels too. So from an environmental standpoint, you can imagine how much less emissions there are with that as well. So all very good things for investors to be keen on, but also just people who are looking for salt in themselves, governments, whatever have you. So gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for your time. There's always so much going on with your company, and I look forward to being able to bring you on again in the near future as well, because that means we're talking about another development, maybe that feasibility study. I know that that's still to come. Investors need to be very excited about that as well. So gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandon. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Brandon.